Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark from spaceflightnow.com, and you're looking live at Launch Complex 39A, where SpaceX is counting down tonight to the scheduled liftoff of this Falcon 9 rocket. The Falcon 9 is set to take off at 9:10 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 1:10 a.m. UTC. With 34 Starlink Internet satellites on board, and notably tonight there is a rideshare payload called BlueWalker 3 on board this Falcon 9 as well. BlueWalker 3 is the test satellite for a planned network of up to 168 satellites being developed by a company called AST Space Mobile. Their mission is to provide direct-to-cell phone connectivity from satellites in orbit. So 35 satellites on board tonight's mission, 34 for SpaceX's Starlink network, 1 test satellite for AST Space Mobile. The Falcon 9 waiting liftoff tonight is powered by a first stage booster going for a record 14th flight. This is booster 1058 in SpaceX's inventory. It debuted back on May the 30th of 2020 with the launch of astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken on the way to the International Space Station. That was the first SpaceX crew mission on the Crew Dragon spacecraft, a very historic launch more than 2 years ago. And the booster has flown 12 times since then for a total of 13 flights, going for 14 tonight. This will be the fleet leader in SpaceX's inventory of reusable boosters. You can see the dark markings on that first stage booster, evidence of its previous trips to suborbital space and back. It will attempt to land again tonight on SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas parked a few hundred miles downrange from the Cape to the northeast of the Kennedy Space Center. That landing on the drone ship by the first stage booster is expected about 8.5 minutes after liftoff. Meanwhile, the upper stage, which is the white cylinder on top of the first stage of the Falcon 9, will continue into orbit. It'll fire its engine 4 times on tonight's mission to place these satellites into 2 distinct orbits. And then the upper stage will fire a 5th time for a deorbit burn, so a total of 5 ignitions of the Merlin vacuum engine on the stage 2 of the Falcon 9 tonight. That's also a record, eclipsing the previous record for upper stage burns by 1. There have been a couple of missions that have burned the upper stage 4 times. Tonight's mission will have 5 burns. So it'll take more than 2 hours for the upper stage to complete all of its maneuvers. Initially, it'll perform 2 burns to place the BlueWalker 3 satellite into an orbit at about 500 kilometers, according to AST. That's the target orbit for their satellite tonight. That satellite will be deployed about 50 minutes after launch. And then there'll be 2 more burns by the upper stage to actually move back to a lower orbit around 320 kilometers, 330 kilometers or so to deploy the 34 Starlink satellites. So liftoff is about 1 hour and 5 minutes away. We're about 30 minutes away from the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket. That will come at T-minus 35 minutes. This is one of 2 Falcon 9s that are on different launch pads tonight at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and the Kennedy Space Center. A few miles to the south at Pad 40, a Falcon 9 is standing vertical in preparation for a launch in the coming days with 54 Starlink Internet satellites. That launch was scheduled for tomorrow night. However, SpaceX had to abort a static fire test earlier this evening. And we're not sure when or if that static fire will be reattempted or that aborts impact on the scheduled launch tomorrow night. So that schedule in some doubt right now, but right now the launch this evening at Pad 39A remains on track, weather permitting, for liftoff at 9:10 p.m. Eastern Time. This will be the 41st SpaceX launch of the year. We've heard from SpaceX Launch Control that they're going to shift to a backup to the back end of tonight's launch window, which is at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 UTC, so that's a 10-minute delay. The liftoff time is now set for exactly 9:20 and 10 seconds p.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 and 10 seconds a.m. UTC. And this is per a recommendation from the Federal Aviation Administration. According to SpaceX, the FAA has oversight and regulatory authority for all commercial space launches here in the United States, and also is responsible for overseeing clearances of air traffic and aviation traffic around launches. So per the FAA's request, SpaceX Launch Control is shifting the launch time back 10 minutes to 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. Now 37 minutes remaining until tonight's revised launch time of 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 a.m. UTC. We expect to hear confirmation shortly on a go or no-go for propellant loading this evening.
Launch auto sequence has started.
T-minus 35 minutes and counting. We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that launch auto has started. This is the start of propellant loading. So kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants now are flowing into the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 39A. Kerosene fuel is also being loaded into the second stage at this time. The liquid oxygen will not start loading into stage 2 until about T-minus 16 minutes. So 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 are currently being loaded with propellants in anticipation of tonight's launch opportunity at 9:20 a.m., 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 a.m. UTC. T-minus 31 minutes and counting. So tonight's mission is carrying 34 Starlink internet satellites into orbit, as well as BlueWalker 3, which is the first full-scale prototype spacecraft for a space-based cellular broadband network being developed by a company called AST Space Mobile. This satellite, as you see here, mounted to the Falcon 9's launch adapter. You can see part of the satellite in this image at the very top. And that black cylinder is the launch adapter structure that will actually connect to the Falcon 9 rocket. And inside that cylinder will be the 34 Starlink satellites on tonight's mission. This satellite weighs about 1.5 metric tons. It's about 3,300 pounds. But what's unique about this satellite is it will unfurl an antenna array in orbit to an area of 693 square feet. That's about 64 square meters. It'll be the largest commercial antenna array in orbit, in low Earth orbit, when fully deployed. And again, this large antenna is needed to connect up with the relatively small antennas on existing cell phones. So it's a space to cell phone connectivity satellite. And this BlueWalker 3 is the prototype for AST Space Mobile's planned network of 168 satellites to provide connectivity to existing unmodified cell phones via satellite. We spoke with Scott Wisniewski, who's the Chief Strategy Officer from AST Space Mobile earlier today. He told us a little more about this mission.
Okay, I'm here with Scott Wisniewski, the Chief Strategy Officer for AST Space Mobile, who's launching their BlueWalker 3 satellite on tonight's Falcon 9 mission. Can you tell us a little bit about what this satellite will be doing?
Sure, happy to, and thanks for having us. BlueWalker 3 is going to be the largest commercially deployed communications array into low Earth orbit ever. It's 693 square feet, and it's designed to test our direct-to-cell phone cellular broadband architecture. We are a company founded on the desire to build cellular broadband direct from space. We've been at it since 2017, and this satellite is designed to connect directly with cell phones, regular cell phones, unmodified cell phones on the ground, and we'll be doing testing on that in the coming months.
And this satellite will be launched, with a stack of Starlink satellites, and then will be deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket. Can you kind of walk us through, like, after it's deployed from the launch vehicle? I'm assuming it has to unfurl this large array of antenna array. Can you talk to us about how that happens, when it happens after the launch, and then some of the testing you'll actually be doing, some specifics there if you have those?
Sure. So we've got some really cool pictures of the satellite, both packed up and unfolded in our factory in Texas. But you can see those pictures on Twitter or YouTube channel. But now it's currently packed, and it's on the Falcon 9 right now. This satellite, will be released within an hour after launch. Once it reaches its target altitude of about 513 kilometers. We'll be looking to make contact with it shortly thereafter. And in the coming days and weeks, we'll be making further contact with the spacecraft, bring things online, and within the next 2 months, hopefully sooner, we'll be able to unfold the satellite. The unfolding process itself is pretty straightforward. Basically, we've compressed the satellite into a cube, and it opens up in two dimensions using the stored energy of hinges that have kind of packed it together. And what opens up is an array of antenna elements pointing down towards the Earth and solar elements pointing up at the sun. And there's 148 individual identical elements that are connected through these mechanical hinges. And we'll start doing testing on those. And I think for us, the unfolding within the first couple of weeks, within the 2-month period, is going to be a critical milestone. And then after that, we'll be doing calibration and then start making phone calls.
And this is a pathfinder for a future constellation of operational satellites, if I understand it correctly. How big of a constellation are you talking about, and when will those start launching?
Yeah, so this is all part of our plan to build 168 satellites globally. This mission, in addition to doing the things that I talked about, kind of turning it on, The actual mission is to, over the 6 months, once it gets going, do testing with over 10 mobile network operators globally across all 6 continents, including Vodafone, Orange, AT&T. And our objective is to calibrate their network so that we can interconnect with them. And our architecture, just like all cell towers, connects to phones directly, and then it connects back to the core for our mobile network operators. So that calibration will be important. We'll be doing that together with the MNOs, as well as folks that are helping us on the equipment technology side on the ground, like Rakuten and Nokia. And this is all, first step. We'll be launching 5 more satellites late next year, and on the path to 168 satellites in total. We've importantly broken down our network so that we can launch it incrementally, so we can provide service as we go. So it's not all one big network or nothing. So as we launch 20, 45, and then the final 60 satellites, we're able to sell services on those various networks in various geographies. So it's a super flexible system where we wholesale capacity to the mobile network operator and ultimately use them and their customers and their spectrum to offer that service to end users around the world.
And I think it's important to point out, you're talking about unmodified cell phones, so like cell phones that you and I have, basically.
Yeah, that's right. So the satellite communications industry today has sat phone companies, of course. That's a pretty small market. It's about $2 billion in revenue a year. It has folks that sell broadband, whether to maritime or aviation or to home broadband. And that's a tens of billions of dollars global market. The wireless services to cell phones, it's a $1 trillion market. There's 5 billion phones around the world. Many people have multiple devices. Connectivity and the demand for connectivity is insatiable, right? So for us as a company, we're very different in that we were founded, developed all of our patents, 2,400 patent pending claims around connecting directly to the phone that is unmodified, that is today. So the phone does not need new frequencies. It does not need new antennas. It is the phone that is in operation in the US, it's in operation in the UK, in Nigeria, in Australia, in Japan. And that's critical because our business model is to partner with the mobile network operator and allow them to send a text to their users when they're out of service and just simply click yes. And then they'll have access to cellular broadband, 4G and 5G. So it's a very elegant and business model and approach. And it's also critical because building a global company in space is a very hard challenge. And by partnering with folks like Vodafone, who's the largest cell carrier globally outside of China, and American Tower, who's the largest cell tower company in the world, both of whom are on our board and have invested in us twice. These are really, really important partners. Vodafone, in fact, we have a mutual exclusivity in all 24 of their countries globally, in Europe and in Africa. So for us, having the right partners is a critical solution because we're focused on the technology and the network.
I've heard this kind of described as like cell towers in space. Is that an accurate description? Do you like that?
Yeah, there's a couple different elements that a cell tower does. And a cell tower, of course, is a distributed network. The point of our network is that it's in space and can cover vast areas. So it can be, it makes sense to offer service where there's not a cell tower. It doesn't make sense to have a distributed network either because of population density or difficult terrain or just certain frequencies haven't been lit up yet. But basically, we've taken the top of the cell tower. That functionality is now on our satellite. Equipment at the base of the tower, we still use on the ground, but we've pulled it back to the mobile network operators headquarters, and that connects with their core. So we've tried to mirror cellular architecture as much as possible, and that's what facilitates our ability to interconnect and send service directly to unmodified phones. It was a critical foundational element for our business and very critical to make sure that we're not only have access to certain phones or certain customers. We want to be as broad as possible, and the technology supports that.
We've seen a couple of announcements recently from SpaceX and T-Mobile, and then Apple and Globalstar about similar technology. What's different about your technology, or is it you're all kind of going to the same market here? Yeah,
well, we think certainly all the extra attention speaks to the viability of the technology and the size of the market opportunity, one that we've been chasing since 2017. That's why we have agreements and understandings with 25 different mobile network operators globally that cover 1.8 billion subscribers, including Vodafone that I mentioned previously. And so, yeah, the direct-to-cell opportunity is a very, very interesting one. It's one that has become increasingly understood to be first possible and then and then 2, executable and a large opportunity. But importantly, we have a large satellite on the launch pad going up tonight. That in this business and in this technology, having a larger satellite is important to connect to the phone without difficulty, because the phone is pretty weak, both in terms of antenna strength and battery power. So so we're starting to see more folks look at this problem. We like our partners, we like our patents, we like our approach, and importantly, we're going to be putting up the largest communications array into low Earth orbit that's ever been done commercially. So it's very critical both to connect to a phone without difficulty, and then also to put good bandwidth, good throughput to the phone. So similar approach, but we're the only one who's targeting cellular broadband and 4G and 5G.
And before I let you go, I know there have been some concerns raised about the brightness of some of these satellites, not just yours, but also the Starlink satellites in low Earth orbit. Do you have any mitigations in place on this satellite, or you're planning anything on your future operational missions to try to reduce the reflectivity, or do you have any estimates how bright they'll be?
This is an industry issue for low Earth orbit, right? And the good news is that we only plan to do 168 satellites, so that the main supporting factor for us is that we have very limited impact just because of the number of satellites we're putting up. But ultimately, there's specialized materials and there's ways you can mitigate the brightness, and that's something that we're actively investigating for our commercial satellites.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Scott, for joining us, and good luck with the launch tonight.
Thanks so much. Good talking to you. Take care. Bye.
That was Scott Wisniewski, the Chief Strategy Officer of AST Space Mobile, talking about BlueWalker 3, which is one of the satellites inside the payload compartment of the Falcon 9 rocket, now 19 minutes, 9 seconds from tonight's launch. In the last minute or so, we've seen the start of the so-called big vent. This is the vent from the strongback of vapor, signifying the start of chill down of liquid oxygen lines leading up the strongback into the second stage. This is in preparation for loading of liquid oxygen into the second stage, beginning in about 2.5 minutes or so. We also heard a call that the RP1 load, kerosene fuel load onto stage 2 is complete. So the countdown continues right on schedule for tonight's launch attempt at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 a.m. UTC.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
Now, T-minus 16 minutes, 15 seconds. We just heard the call that Stage 2 LOX load has started, so this is the start of liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. The countdown remains on schedule for 9:20 p.m. liftoff. That's 1:20 a.m. UTC. The payloads on tonight's mission include that BlueWalker 3 satellite we've discussed a little bit earlier, as well as 34 more Starlink internet satellites. If you're just joining us, you're watching a live view of the Falcon 9 rocket now being loaded with propellants at Launch Complex 39A. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of SpaceflightNow.com, reporting live on tonight's countdown from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We're about 3 miles away from the launch pad this evening. If you haven't had a chance to do so yet, please like our stream. That helps us reach a bigger audience and bring this coverage to more viewers. Also, if you're interested, please consider joining our YouTube channel. We have membership levels available for you to choose from, and depending on which tier you select, you can gain access to exclusive video features, and you'll be helping us support our coverage, so we hope you'll consider that. You can also contribute to our coverage and help us continue to bring you coverage like tonight's if you support us in the Super Chat function on YouTube. We would really appreciate any support you can provide there. We're now 15 minutes from liftoff. This is the 41st SpaceX launch of the year, and it's also the 39th rather, launch of the year from Cape Canaveral or the Kennedy Space Center. Tonight's launch also marks the 175th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket since its debut back in June of 2010. So the 175th flight of a Falcon 9 overall, and the 41st Falcon 9 launch of 2022. Now 12 minutes, 13 seconds from liftoff. We talked about AST Space Mobile's BlueWalker 3 satellite a few minutes ago, but the other satellites on board include 34 more spacecraft poised to join SpaceX's Starlink Internet network. This will bring the total number of Starlink satellites launched to 3,293. So this file photo from our previous missions shows what a stack of Starlink satellites looks like in launch configuration. This stack of Starlink satellites is roughly 50 satellites. So tonight's mission will be a stack of Starlinks that is somewhat shorter at 34 satellites. They're packed on one on top of the other, held down onto the launch adapter with retention rods. And for tonight's mission, the BlueWalker 3 satellite from AST is actually mounted on top of the stack of Starlink satellites. We talked about BlueWalker 3 a few minutes ago. We showed a picture of it in launch configuration. This is what the antenna array looks like fully unfurled. So there are 148 individual elements to this array, all connected together with hinges into a cube configuration. And in the first couple of months after launch, sometime later this fall, once the conditions are right, AST will send the command to deploy this antenna array to 693 square feet. This is the largest communications antenna array ever deployed in low Earth orbit at an altitude of about 300 miles. So this is a rather large antenna. You can see the scale of it with the ground team there for reference. And this will provide direct space to cell phone connectivity. This is a prototype for a planned constellation of 168 spacecraft that AST is developing. And there are concerns among the astronomy community about the brightness of this satellite, the reflectivity of this array, especially around twilight, at dawn and dusk, as it catches sunlight and potentially reflects that down to the Earth. And we'll see how bright this is. There's no estimate that we've seen of how bright this spacecraft will be, but a lot of eyes will be watching it when it deploys this array sometime later this fall. We won't have an idea of how bright it is shortly after launch because it won't have deployed, but that information should come later this year with the deployment and unfurling of this antenna array. So back to the Starlink satellites. There are 34 on tonight's mission, heading up to an operational orbit of 335 miles, 540 kilometers. Each of these satellites is flat-packed on the Falcon 9, weighs about a quarter ton, and they are built by SpaceX in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. Of course, if you're not familiar, this is what a ground terminal for the Starlink network looks like. So Starlink consumers, if they sign up for the service, can get an antenna like this and pay a monthly subscription fee for internet connectivity, internet service through the Starlink fleet. Right now, SpaceX says there are 40 countries where the Starlink service is available. The most recent country where it's been added is Malta. Now, 9 minutes from launch, we're now inside the final 9 minutes of the countdown this evening. The next major milestone will come at T-minus 7 minutes. That's when the Merlin engines on the bottom of the the main stage of the Falcon 9 will be thermally conditioned for ignition. That's coming up at T-minus 7 minutes. As you can see here in this countdown timeline, we've passed the first few milestones. Propellant loading started at 35 minutes. Liquid oxygen on stage 2 began flowing at 16 minutes. And then at 5.5 minutes, we should hear a call that the RP1 or kerosene fuel load is complete on both stages. And at T-minus 4 minutes and 30 seconds or so, the strongback structure, the mast to the right side of the Falcon 9, will begin its retraction to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle. That's the position it will stay in until ignition, when it begins a more rapid retraction to allow the Falcon 9 to climb off the pad. At T-minus 2 minutes, the final liquid oxygen will be loaded into the vehicle, and the Falcon 9 will be declared fully loaded, fully fueled for launch at about T-minus 2 minutes. At T-minus 1 minute, the onboard computer on the Falcon 9 will take command of the countdown. Propellant tanks will be pressurized for flight. The launch director will verify their go for launch at about 45 seconds. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller will command the ignition sequence for all 9 Merlin engines on the bottom of the first stage of the Falcon 9. Those will throttle up to about 1.7 million pounds of thrust collectively. And if they pass a health check, an automated health check, the onboard computer will give the command for liftoff at T0. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will be heading northeast from the Kennedy Space Center, from the Launch Complex 39A area. This red band shows the expected ground track tonight. The first stage, booster 1058, will be landing on the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, positioned east of Charleston, South Carolina. That's where the first stage will attempt its landing to complete its 14th mission tonight. We just heard a confirmation at T-minus 7 minutes of engine chill down. So the Falcon 9's engines are being thermally conditioned for flight at this time. This involves flowing liquid oxygen through the engine compartment into the engine components themselves to make sure that they are at the proper temperature for the flow, the more rapid flow of propellants at T0 when those engines ignite. Now T-minus 6 minutes, 10 seconds, and counting.
Stage 1 RP1 load is complete.
And there's the call a bit earlier than usual of the Stage 1 RP1 load complete. So about 46,000 gallons of kerosene have been loaded into the rocket this evening. Liquid oxygen still flowing into the vehicle for another few more minutes.
Falcon tanks are pressing for strong back retract.
Now 3.5 minutes to go. 3 minutes,
Strong back retract.
30 seconds. The strong back out at pad 39A is retracting away from the vehicle at this time. Everything continuing to look good for liftoff this evening. 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 a.m. UTC.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete. And Stage 1 POGO.
Now 2 minutes to go. 2 minutes left until the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from pad 39A here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
We've heard Stage 2 LOX load complete, so the Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with about 1 million pounds of propellants, awaiting liftoff in 1 minute 34 seconds. T-minus 90 seconds.
Ground gas closeout.
coming up on T-minus 60 seconds. At 1 minute before launch, the control of the countdown will pass from the ground computer to the onboard computer of the Falcon 9 rocket. T-minus 60 seconds. That handoff should be occurring now. And we've heard Falcon 9 is in startup, so the Falcon 9's onboard computer is now in control of the rest of the countdown. We should hear a final go from the launch director momentarily. We've heard that go from the launch director. Everything looking good. 35 seconds. T-minus 20. Engine start should occur at T-minus 3 seconds. T-minus 10 seconds. T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition. And liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Complex 39A, hauling more Starlink satellites into orbit, and AST Space Mobile's BlueWalker 3 satellite. Falcon 9 heading downrange, heading northeast from the Kennedy Space Center. Everything looking good 20 seconds into the flight. One minute, 20 seconds into the flight. We hope you enjoyed some of that rumble from the Merlin engines. Those engines are producing about 1.7 million pounds of thrust as the Falcon 9 heads northeast from NASA's Kennedy Space Center, now arcing out over the Atlantic Ocean. It's passed through a thin layer of cloud cover, but we're still having some good visibility of the vehicle. T plus 1 minute, 50 seconds. At about 2.5 minutes, about 30 seconds from now, we'll see a series of events in quick succession. We'll see main engine cutoff, or MECO, of the first stage. A few seconds later, we should see stage separation. The first stage will begin its descent back toward the drone ship, and then the upper stage will light its Merlin vacuum engine for the first of 5 burns of that engine planned for tonight's mission. A very complex upper stage profile tonight. Standing by for main engine cutoff. And we've seen main engine cutoff. Standing by for staging. And there's stage separation. We're watching views now from onboard cameras from SpaceX. We've switched over to SpaceX's video stream for now. This comes with a few seconds delay, and we've seen confirmation of engine start. Second stage engine start. So the Merlin vacuum engine has ignited for the first of its 5 burns this evening. Both vehicles reported to be on nominal trajectories from SpaceX. Now 3.5 minutes into the flight. Falcon 9's upper stage now has accelerated past 9,100 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 115 kilometers. Those numbers evident displayed on the lower right. On the lower left is stage 1 telemetry. So the booster is now decelerating after completing its burn. It'll be reaching apogee, or the highest point of its ballistic trajectory, and then begin its descent back into the atmosphere. This map shows the relative locations of the Stage 2 and Stage 1 vehicles. Stage 1 heading toward the drone ship, Stage 2 continuing to accelerate up to orbital velocity.
Acquisition of signal, Bermuda.
A downrange tracking station in Bermuda has received and acquired signals from the Falcon 9 as it continues to head northeast from the Kennedy Space Center. Now 6 minutes into the flight of the Falcon 9 rocket on the Starlink 4-2 BlueWalker 3 mission. No problems reported so far since the liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center, which occurred at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
The first stage has reignited 3 of its engines for an entry burn. This is a braking burn to slow down for re-entry deeper into the atmosphere. And we've seen entry burn shut down. One more burn left on the first stage. That'll be a landing burn using just the center engine, beginning about 30 seconds or so before touchdown. 7 minutes into the flight. See stage 2 as passing between Bermuda and the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Stage 1 in the final minute to minute and a half of its flight, heading for the drone ship.
Stage 1 transonic. Expected loss of signal, Cape. Stage 2 terminal guidance. Stage 1 landing burn.
And we've heard landing burn ignition is underway on this first stage. Booster 1058 heading for the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas out in the Atlantic Ocean. Let's watch the first stage as it heads for touchdown.
Landing leg deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And there it is. Booster 1058 has arrived on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas out in the Atlantic Ocean. This completes this booster's 14th flight, a record for SpaceX's fleet of reusable boosters. Great view here from the drone ship.
Nominal parking orbit insertion.
Showing the booster on the deck after a successful launch and landing this evening. In the meantime, we've heard confirmation that the upper stage has completed its first burn this evening. This is the first of 5 engine firings on stage 2 tonight. 4 of those are needed to place the satellites into 2 different orbits. Another one, the 5th and final burn, will be the deorbit burn on the second stage. So the second stage with its payloads has arrived in a parking orbit. Another burn is scheduled in about 36 minutes. That'll be a very brief 4-second maneuver to set the stage for deployment of AST's BlueWalker 3 satellite at about T+50 minutes. 2 more burns after that will lower the altitude of the second stage to set up for deployment of the 34 Starlink satellites about 2 hours and 4 minutes into the mission. That'll be at about 11:24 p.m. Eastern Time, 3:24 a.m. UTC for the final major event on tonight's flight. Now 11.5 minutes into tonight's flight, SpaceX has ended their webcast this evening, so we don't expect to get any more live video from the Falcon 9 rocket. However, the mission is far from complete, with an unprecedented number of burns on the second stage engine still to go tonight.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
If SpaceX follows their usual practice, we'll continue to have access to their launch control audio, and we'll bring that to you on this stream throughout the rest of the mission as the second stage completes its critical milestones to place these payloads into 2 different orbits tonight. The second stage now passing just off the coast of Newfoundland. It'll be heading out over the North Atlantic Ocean and then over Europe before swinging southeast over the Indian Ocean. So again, 3 more burns still to go on the second stage before the final spacecraft deployment event, and then following that another burn by the upper stage will deorbit that rocket to help prevent the creation of any unnecessary space junk from tonight's flight. Next major burn is about 35 minutes away at about T+47 minutes. Here's a view of Launch Complex 39A, where the Falcon 9 lifted off 13.5 minutes ago. You can see that strong back mast is retracted back to an angle of about 45 degrees or so. That retraction occurred right at liftoff. and then the Falcon 9 strongback will be lowered horizontal sometime in the coming days, we expect, and rolled back to the hangar to prepare for the next Falcon 9 launch from this pad. Currently, the next Falcon 9 launch from 39A is scheduled for early October. That is the next crew launch to the International Space Station under contract to NASA, the Crew 5 mission. That is currently the next scheduled launch from pad 39A.
Expected loss of signal, Newfoundland. Acquisition of signal, Goonhilly. Unexpected loss of signal, Goonhilly.
Now, more than 25 minutes into the mission, you're hearing occasional verbal callouts from the launch team at SpaceX as the upper stage passes in and out of range of various ground stations. After departing the Kennedy Space Center at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, the Falcon 9 was initially tracked by antennas here locally on Florida Space Coast. Then it passed in range of a ground station downrange in Bermuda. Then there was a ground station in Newfoundland that tracked the rocket for a few minutes. And that was followed by the pass over the Goonhilly ground station in the UK. And just a minute or so ago, we heard the call that the rocket is now outside the range of the Goonhilly station. So currently, the Falcon 9 is in an expected loss of signal until the next ground station regains contact with the rocket as it continues its flight around the world. Now passing over the Black Sea, soon to swing over Turkey, and then the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, and then after that head out over the Indian Ocean. Now 20 minutes left until the expected restart of the second stage engine. Here's the upcoming events for tonight's flight. At T plus 47 minutes, 16 seconds, that Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage should relight for a burn about 4 seconds to circularize the orbit. That will set the stage for deployment of BlueWalker 3, which is riding on the top of the payload stack at about T plus 49 minutes, 51 seconds. With BlueWalker 3 deployed, the attention will turn to maneuvering into a lower orbit for release of the Starlink satellites. 2 more burns of the upper stage are planned, one at about an hour and 7 minutes after launch, another one at about an hour and 54 minutes after launch. Both of those burns will be rather brief, less than 10 seconds in duration. That's all that's needed from that powerful Merlin vacuum engine. That engine produces about 200,000 pounds of thrust, which is a lot for an upper stage. And then separation of the 34 Starlink satellites is scheduled for about 2 hours, 4 minutes after liftoff. That equates to around 11:24 p.m. Eastern Time, 3:24 a.m. UTC. That's when we expect to hear the call that the 34 Starlinks are off the Falcon 9 rocket. And that will mark the time that SpaceX can declare mission success tonight. A final burn of the upper stage is planned later, a deorbit burn to maneuver into an orbit that will fall into the atmosphere to allow the second stage to burn up in the atmosphere over an area of unpopulated ocean. So these are the major events still to come tonight. 5 burns by the upper stage on tonight's mission, 1 already complete, 4 to go. The record going into tonight for SpaceX was 4 upper stage burns on a single mission. So both with the booster with its 14th flight now complete, as well as the upper stage with its 5 burns, are pushing the limits and setting records for SpaceX on tonight's mission. Now 30 minutes since launch. If you haven't had a chance to and you're still with us for our post-launch coverage of the remainder of tonight's flight sequence, please like our stream. You can also join our YouTube channel. We have various membership levels for you to choose from, and your contribution there helps us continue and expand our coverage of launch activity and other major events in the space industry around the world. So any contribution you can provide to us through our memberships or in the super chat here on YouTube would be greatly appreciated.
Acquisition of signal, Maldives. Acquisition of signal, Diego Garcia. Acquisition of signal, Mauritius.
Now T plus 44 minutes, 30 seconds. We're about 3 minutes or so from the expected time of restart of the second stage engine, the Merlin vacuum engine on the Falcon 9. The rocket is now in range of a ground station in Mauritius. So we expect this ground station to hopefully be tracking the Falcon 9 when this restart occurs. This is expected to be a 4-second burn, beginning at T plus 47 minutes and 16 seconds to be exact. And this will circularize the orbit, placing the Falcon 9 in the right altitude and the right inclination for deployment of the BlueWalker 3 satellite for AST Space Mobile.
Nominal orbit insertion.
We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the second burn of the upper stage engine resulted in a nominal orbit insertion. So looks like that was a good burn by the stage 2 engine. And that sets the stage for separation of BlueWalker 3 coming in less than 2 minutes time.
Expected loss of signal, Mauritius. Expected loss of signal, Maldives. Expected loss of signal. Diego Garcia.
Now T plus 49 minutes 55 seconds. We've passed the expected time of BlueWalker 3 satellite separation. But we've also heard a series of loss of signal calls. These are expected calls as the Falcon 9 heads out over the southern Indian Ocean. So right now the Falcon 9 is outside the range of any ground stations. So we may not hear confirmation of the separation of BlueWalker 3 until the upper stage is back within range of the next ground station, which is likely the Tasmania ground station off the southeast coast of Australia. That ground station is likely 5 to 10 minutes away.
BlueWalker 3 separation confirmed.
Acquisition of signal, Tasmania.
You just heard confirmation that BlueWalker 3, the first payload on tonight's mission, has successfully deployed from the Falcon 9 upper stage in orbit. The rocket and satellite are now in range of a ground station in Tasmania. So there was a bit of a wait, about 11 minutes or so of a wait to confirm deployment of this BlueWalker 3 spacecraft. The deployment actually occurred with the Falcon 9 outside of ground station coverage. So BlueWalker 3 is now flying free of the Falcon 9. Still 2 more upper stage burns to go, followed by separation of 34 Starlink internet satellites. Here's a slide we showed a little bit earlier in our coverage, but just a refresher on BlueWalker 3. This spacecraft, which you see in this image taken before the launch inside of one of SpaceX's payload processing facilities here at Cape Canaveral, is built and owned by a company called AST Space Mobile. This is a Texas-based company that is planning a fleet of 168 satellites. And this is the first prototype that will be followed potentially as soon as next year by the first 5 operational satellites, which are also expected to fly on a Falcon 9 rocket, likely a dedicated Falcon 9 rocket. This BlueWalker 3 satellite has a launch mass of about 1.5 metric tons, or about 3,300 pounds. What's unique about this satellite, though, is its antenna. This communications array will unfurl to an area of 693 square feet, or about 64 square meters in orbit. That's a little bit bigger than a typical studio apartment. And this will be the largest communications array in low Earth orbit. And the antenna is designed to connect directly to unmodified cell phones. So AST Space Mobile has agreements with companies like Vodafone, AT&T, and Orange, and other mobile network operators to use BlueWalker 3 to connect to their networks and cell phones on those networks in a series of tests over the next few months. It'll take a few weeks to a few months before AST is actually ready to pull the trigger and unfurl this antenna array in low Earth orbit. Here you see what that array will look like when it's fully deployed, and some of the members of the test and ground team here in those blue jackets in the background for scale. There are 148 different individual elements of this array connected together with mechanical hinges, and those will unfurl in 2 dimensions when AST ground teams are confident that the satellite is ready for this critical operation. Again, that's not expected to occur until later this fall. There is some concern among members of the astronomy community about how reflective and how bright this antenna array will be. You may have heard concerns about the Starlink satellites, SpaceX's internet satellites, and the brightness of those. This antenna array is much larger than those, and it'll be interesting to see how bright and how reflective this satellite is when the antenna is fully unfurled, but we won't know that until later this fall. So BlueWalker 3 is now flying free of the Falcon 9 rocket. The upper stage continues in orbit. Here you see the upper stage is passing south of Tasmania. It'll soon pass over New Zealand, and then head out over the Pacific Ocean. 2 more burns of the upper stage engine are still to come before the rocket reaches the proper orbit for deployment of the 34 Starlink satellites. The first of those burns is expected in about 3 minutes or so, at about T plus 1 hour, 7 minutes, 36 seconds. That'll be a very short 2-second burn. That'll be followed about 45 minutes later by another burn at T plus 1 hour 54 minutes. And these burns are necessary to change the altitude of the upper stage to reach the proper conditions for separation of the 34 Starlink satellites, which that separation event is planned at T plus 2 hours and 4 minutes, about an hour from now.
Nominal orbit insertion.
We've heard the call nominal orbit insertion from SpaceX Launch Control. This confirms the completion of the third burn by the upper stage. Here you see the remaining events for tonight's mission. This third burn now complete. About 45 minutes away from the fourth burn, which will last about 9 seconds. That will change orbits again to set the stage for deployment of the 34 Starlink Internet satellites. So these burns are designed to change the orbit of the Falcon 9. This burn number 3, just completed, changed the orbit from a more circular orbit to a more elliptical or elongated orbit. It essentially lowered the perigee, or the low point of the orbit. And then this next burn coming up in about 45 minutes will circularize that orbit at the lower altitude. These orbits, this rocket is moving from an orbit of about 500 kilometers down to about 330 kilometers with these maneuvers.
Expect the loss of signal, Tasmania.
Now 1 hour, 25 minutes, 30 seconds. Now 1 hour, 25 minutes, 50 seconds since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. The upper stage of the Falcon 9 is now passing over the central Pacific Ocean, heading northeast. About 27 minutes remaining until the final burn that is necessary to place the 34 Starlink satellites into the proper orbit for separation. And about 38 minutes remaining until the separation event itself. No problems reported so far with tonight's Falcon 9 mission. The BlueWalker 3 satellite has already separated from the Falcon 9 upper stage. That occurred about 35 minutes ago. So we saw the booster, number 1058, complete its 14th flight tonight. The rocket lifted off from pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, or 1:20 a.m. UTC. And this chart shows the flight history for this booster. This is a record 14th flight for a Falcon 9 first stage. This booster debuted back on May the 30th of 2020 with the Crew Dragon Demo 2 mission. This was the first astronaut launch conducted by SpaceX with 2 NASA astronauts, Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, on board on a test flight up to the International Space Station. So this booster is an historic one in SpaceX's inventory. With that first flight, it launched again in July 2020 with the South Korean military's Anasis-2 communications satellite. It has also launched a space station resupply mission, CRS-21, back in December 2020, as well as 2 transporter small satellite rideshare missions, Transporter 1 in 2021 and Transporter 3 at the beginning of this year. In addition to those missions, this booster has also now launched a number of Starlink missions. So 14 flights for booster number 1058, and the booster landed on the drone ship a shortfall of gravitas about 8.5 minutes into the flight. That drone ship will bring this booster back to Port Canaveral for potential refurbishment and preparation for a 15th flight sometime down the road.
Acquisition of signal, South Texas. Acquisition of signal, Cape.
Now 1 hour, 41 minutes, 35 seconds into this evening's flight of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. You can see in this map the rocket is now passing over the heartland of the United States. It has passed over the Pacific Ocean over the last 30 minutes or so. It flew over Mexico, crossed into Texas, and is now approaching the Great Lakes. You've heard call-outs periodically on the audio stream from SpaceX Launch Control as the Falcon 9 has passed inside and outside of the range of various ground stations. Most recently, it has passed in the range of ground stations down in South Texas at the Starbase facility, where SpaceX is developing the Super Heavy and Starship vehicles. Now it is inside the range of the tracking station here at the Cape. So the Falcon 9 has completed one orbit of the Earth and is back in range of the Cape Canaveral tracking station. Restart of the upper stage engine for its fourth burn tonight is about 11 minutes away. In this map, you can also see the labeled location of stage 1. That's where the booster from the Falcon 9 rocket has landed on the drone ship. That landing occurred about 8.5 minutes after the liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center. The white lines here show the track that the Falcon 9 has flown so far in this mission. The blue lines show the future trajectory for this orbit as well as the next orbit. So about 10.5 minutes remaining until this next burn by the Merlin vacuum engine on the stage 2 of the Falcon 9 rocket. This Merlin vacuum engine burn that's coming up will last about 9 seconds and will circularize the orbit of the Falcon 9 to set up for separation of 34 Starlink internet satellites. The other payload, AST Space Mobile's BlueWalker 3 satellite, is already separated from the Falcon 9. That occurred nearly an hour ago. But 34 Starlink satellites still are on board the rocket. And this next burn, coming up in about 10 minutes, will set the stage for the deployment of those 34 Starlink satellites.
Expected loss of signal, South Texas. Acquisition of signal, Bermuda. Acquisition of signal, Newfoundland. Expected loss of signal, Cape. Acquisition of signal, Goon Heli.
The Falcon 9 is now in range of a ground station at Goon Heli in the UK. So that tracking station will be receiving signals from the Falcon 9 as it prepares for this fourth burn coming up in just a few seconds' time.
Nominal orbit insertion. Expected loss of signal, Newfoundland.
We've just heard confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the fourth burn of the second stage engine is complete and resulted in a nominal orbit insertion. This burn was aiming to place the Starlink satellites into a near circular orbit between 324 and 334 kilometers, a lower altitude from the roughly 500 kilometers that the BlueWalker 3 payload was deployed at. Again, SpaceX was able to confirm this burn in real time through the Goon Heli tracking station in Cornwall, England. We're now about 8 minutes or so, 8.5 minutes until the expected time of deployment of the 34 Starlink internet satellites. We're not sure yet if the SpaceX launch team will have real-time tracking of that event. Confirmation of the Starlink deployment may have to wait until the rocket is in range of a ground station farther down range, potentially in the Indian Ocean or in Kenya. But we'll stand by until we do receive that final confirmation of Starlink deployment. So at that point, SpaceX can declare mission success for tonight's Falcon 9 launch. The Falcon 9 lifted off from Pad 39A here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, or 1:20 a.m. UTC. Tonight's flight is the 175th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010. It's also the 183rd flight of a Falcon rocket overall. This includes Falcon 1s, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavy missions since 2006. We've mentioned several times tonight this was a record-breaking launch in terms of booster reuse. This was the 14th flight for this particular booster, Booster 1058, which is already on the deck of the drone ship. A shortfall of gravitas in the Atlantic Ocean. That landing occurred in the first 9 minutes of the flight earlier this evening. This breaks a three-way tie for 13 flights with 2 other rockets, so Booster 1058 now has 14 missions under its belt. This was the 150th Falcon 9 launch from Florida's Space Coast from launch pads 39A or Pad 40 at neighboring Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This was the 54th SpaceX launch from Pad 39A and the 148th launch overall from this historic launch site dating back to 1967. Some more mission stats. This was the 117th flight of a reused Falcon 9 booster. This was the 60th launch that's been primarily dedicated to the Starlink network. This mission had a rideshare payload, which was this BlueWalker 3 satellite from AST Space Mobile. But the 34 Starlink satellites on board made up the bulk of the mass going to space tonight on the Falcon 9 rocket. This was the 41st SpaceX launch of the year. And it was the 39th orbital launch attempt overall from Cape Canaveral or the Kennedy Space Center so far in 2022. This includes missions from SpaceX, which has done most of the flights from the Cape so far this year, as well as United Launch Alliance and 2 launch attempts from Astra. Both of those failed to reach orbit, but there were 2 Astra launches earlier in the year as well. Now, an hour, 58 minutes, 40 seconds into the flight, the second stage of the Falcon rocket is about to pass over France and then head out over the Mediterranean Sea and finally over North Africa, heading southeast, about 5 minutes away from the expected time of deployment of the 34 Starlink internet satellites.
expected LOS, Coon Heli.
T plus 2 hours, 3 minutes, 43 seconds since the liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket. The deployment of the 34 Starlink internet satellites should be occurring now, but we just heard that the Falcon 9 is now outside the range of the Goonhilly tracking station in England. The Falcon 9 is now over the Mediterranean Sea. It's just passed over Sicily, soon to head over North Africa. And the next ground station that will receive signals from the Falcon 9 won't be for another 10 minutes or so, likely either the Maldives or Malindi, Kenya, or perhaps Mauritius. Those 3 ground stations are coming up in about 10 minutes on this current ground track for the Falcon 9 upper stage. And at that point, we hope to hear confirmation through telemetry data relayed from the Falcon 9 down to launch control that the 34 Starlink satellites have successfully separated from the Falcon 9 upper stage in orbit.
Acquisition of signal Malindi.
Two hours, 11 minutes into the flight, the Falcon 9 is now in range of a ground station in Malindi, Kenya. We're still standing by for confirmation of Starlink separation.
Acquisition of signal, Mauritius. Nominal deorbit burn.
Now 2 hours, 18 minutes, and 15 seconds since the liftoff of the Starlink 4-2 and BlueWalker 3 mission on SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. The Falcon 9 is now over the Indian Ocean, passing just to the north of Madagascar. We've heard confirmation just in the last few moments of a nominal deorbit burn. This was the 5th planned burn of the upper stage engine on tonight's flight to maneuver the rocket onto a trajectory to re-enter the atmosphere and burn up harmlessly over the ocean. However, we're still standing by for SpaceX to confirm another critical event on tonight's mission. We did not hear any confirmation on the audio loops of Starlink deployment. That should have occurred about 15 minutes ago.
Starlink deploy confirmed.
And we just heard confirmation of Starlink deployment right at this moment through the control audio loops from SpaceX Launch Control. So this appears to have been a successful flight, although the confirmation of those events was out of order, somewhat peculiarly. So we'll wait for official confirmation from SpaceX, perhaps on social media. And there it is on SpaceX's Twitter feed, confirmation of the deployment of the 34 Starlink internet satellites. So with that, all 35 satellites on tonight's mission have deployed from SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. We heard confirmation earlier, about an hour and a half ago, of the separation of the BlueWalker 3 satellite for AST Space Mobile. That's a new, the first satellite in a new network of spacecraft designed to provide connectivity directly to cell phones from satellites in orbit. And then 34 Starlink satellites deployed from the Falcon 9 after further maneuvers into a slightly lower orbit. Here's a live shot of Launch Complex 39A, where the Falcon 9 lifted off 2 hours, 20 minutes, and 49 seconds ago at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, or 1:20 a.m. UTC. This was the 41st SpaceX launch of the year, and the 39th launch overall from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station or Kennedy Space Center so far in 2022. The record pace of launches continues. Looking ahead, here are the launches we'll be covering over the next 10 days or so. Beginning tomorrow with the launch of Firefly Aerospace's Alpha launch vehicle from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. This is the Alpha's second demonstration flight. Firefly calls this mission To the Black. It's carrying several CubeSats into orbit from Vandenberg Space Force Base. The first Alpha test flight last September, but this time last year, failed. An engine failed about a few seconds after liftoff, and the rocket lost control and the flight was terminated about a minute or so into the mission. So this is the second launch of Firefly's Alpha rocket, scheduled for tomorrow during a window from 3 to 7 p.m. Pacific time at 6 to 10 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll be covering that on spaceflightnow.com as it happens. The next SpaceX launch is currently a bit of a question mark. It was scheduled for tomorrow night, at 10:53 p.m. Eastern from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, just a few miles to the south of Pad 39A, where we saw the launch this evening. However, a test firing of the Falcon 9 on Pad 40 was aborted earlier this afternoon during a rather strong thunderstorm. We're not sure if the abort was caused due to the weather or some other technical issue, but with the static fire having not occurred, the launch date tomorrow night is a bit in question. We've also seen some maritime notices to mariners indicate that the launch may have delayed until later in the week, perhaps Tuesday night. That is to be confirmed right now. But the target launch date for this Starlink 4-34 mission is a bit up in the air. It was scheduled for tomorrow, but we have indications that it could be delayed a couple of days into next week. Following that is another Falcon 9 launch from Pad 40 with the Starlink 4-35 mission, the next batch of Starlink satellites. That launch date is currently penciled in for September the 19th. However, that date could hinge on when the 4-34 mission takes off. So if we see a 2-day delay on the Starlink 4-34 mission, there also may be a delay down the line for this next flight, currently scheduled for September the 19th. On September the 21st, we'll be covering a launch of the next crew heading to the International Space Station. This is a crew of 2 Russian cosmonauts and NASA astronaut Frank Rubio heading up to the ISS on the Soyuz MS-22 spacecraft. This launch will occur from Site 31 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. They'll be beginning a half year in orbit on the International Space Station. Later in the month, perhaps as soon as September the 23rd, NASA is scheduled to make its next launch attempt for the Artemis 1 moon mission. The launch date right now, as I said, is no earlier than September the 23rd, but that hinges on a few caveats, one of which is the successful repair and retest of a hydrogen leak located in the tail service mast area near the bottom of the core stage. That leak repair has been completed at Pad 39A. The team has replaced some seals in a liquid hydrogen line, 2 liquid hydrogen lines, one of which was found to be leaking on a launch attempt back on September the 3rd. So with those seals replaced and teams now working on reconnecting the hydrogen umbilical to the rocket, NASA is setting up for a tanking test no earlier than next Saturday, a week from today, on September the 17th, to load cryogenic propellants into the Space Launch System moon rocket. The goal there is to verify that the hydrogen leak has been resolved, and that would give NASA's team confidence heading into the next launch attempt, again, perhaps as soon as later this month. The other issue of note is the certification of batteries on the rocket's flight termination system. This system is the destruct mechanism that would be used to terminate the flight and destroy the rocket if it veered off course and threatened any populated areas. The Space Force, which runs the Eastern Range here at Cape Canaveral and KSC, is responsible for public safety, and they have oversight authority over flight termination systems on all rockets that launch from the Cape or from Kennedy Space Center. And right now, NASA has submitted a request for a waiver or extension for the certification life of those batteries, and that's currently under review by the Eastern Range officials here at Cape Canaveral to see if they're going to be able to approve that. We haven't heard yet whether the range will indeed grant that extension for the life of those batteries. If they don't, the rocket will have to be returned to the vehicle assembly building for a recheck and retest of those batteries, which would certainly delay the launch into October, into mid-October at least, perhaps later, depending on how long that retest takes and how long it takes to actually configure the rocket to move back to the VAB, and then how long it takes to return it to the pad in preparation for the next launch campaign. So a lot of question marks also over that launch schedule for Artemis 1. But what we know right now is NASA is gearing up for a tanking test next Saturday, September the 17th, to check to see if they've fixed this hydrogen leak. And from there, the two paths would either be to proceed with the launch attempts September the 23rd or September the 27th, if the range approves that flight termination system extension, or to prep the rocket to roll back to the VAB for that flight termination system recheck before they can proceed with the launch in October or November. So we'll leave you now with a live shot of pad 39A, where the Falcon 9 took off nearly 2.5 hours ago. The next launch from here on Florida's Space Coast is another Falcon 9 rocket sometime in the next few days. Was scheduled for tomorrow night. However, we have indications that may be delayed a couple of days. Keep track of the launch schedule on spaceflightnow.com for updates there. And we'll have coverage of that mission when it happens on our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us tonight for this launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 Starlink 4-2/BlueWalker 3 mission, the 41st SpaceX launch of the year now in the books. Good night from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We'll see you next time.